Now, imagine waiting in a tent, the fabric whipping violently around you like a trapped animal, while your own hands turn the color of charcoal. You are not a novice. You are not a rich tourist who paid for a guided tour. You are Vitaliy Gorelik, a titan of the Russian national team, a man forged in the snows. And yet, you are dying. The date is February 6, 2012. We are at the base of K2, the savage mountain, during the most brutal season on Earth, winter. No human had ever stood on the summit of K2 in winter and returned to tell the tale. The ambition was absolute. The prize was history. But the cost was sitting in a tent, gasping for air that simply wasn't there. Gorelik wasn't just cold. He was suffering from severe frostbite and advanced pneumonia, a combination that turns the human body into a ticking clock. The tragedy of Vitaliy Gorelik isn't just that he died, it is how close salvation was. A helicopter, a machine of miracles in the mountains, was dispatched. It was the lifeline. The team could hear the thrum of the rotors cutting through the thin air, a mechanical heartbeat promising life. But the savage mountain has a cruel sense of irony. The weather, the very entity that had broken Vitaly's body, slammed the door shut. The winds rose, the visibility dropped to zero, and the helicopter was forced to turn back. In that moment, as the sound of the engine faded into the roar of the blizzard, the reality settled in. There would be no rescue, there would be no glory. There was only the ice, the waiting, and the agonizing question that haunts every climber who has ever looked up at the death zone. At what point does the pursuit of greatness become a suicide pact? Why do we trade the warmth of a life for a frozen grave in the clouds? This is not just a story about a failed expedition. This is a story about the fragile boundary between human endurance and the indifferent wrath of nature. It is a story about the winter that won. Welcome to K2 Stories. Before we ascend into the freezing darkness of 2012, make sure you are subscribed, because today, we are climbing into the heart of a tragedy that changed Russian mountaineering forever. To understand why Vitaliy Gorelik died, you first have to understand the breed of men he belonged to. In the high-altitude mountaineering community, there are climbers, and then there are the Russians. This is not a stereotype. It is a distinction of methodology and pain tolerance. Vitaliy was 44 years old, born in Novosibirsk, a man carved from the harsh realities of Siberia. He wasn't looking for spiritual enlightenment on the mountain. He was a technician of the vertical world. He had been nominated for the Pilot Dorotha Oscars of mountaineering for a new route on Pobeda Peak. He was a snow leopard, a title reserved only for those who have conquered the 5 highest peaks in the former Soviet Union. He was, by every metric, unbreakable. He came to K2 in the winter of 2011-2012 as a key member of the Russian national team. This wasn't a commercial expedition where wealthy tourists are short-roped to the summit. This was a siege. The Russian strategy is famous for its military precision, heavy logistics, massive teamwork, and a philosophy that treats the mountain like a fortress to be breached. They don't just climb, they go to war. Their goal was monumental: to claim the first winter ascent of K2, the last great prize in Himalayan mountaineering. While Everest is a slog, K2 is a pyramid of technical terror, steeper, sharper, and deadlier. And in winter, K2 ceases to be a mountain and becomes a hostile planet. But the mountain was waiting. We need to talk about the death zone. You have heard the term, but you have likely never felt its weight. Above 8,000 meters, roughly 26,000 feet, human life is impossible. The air holds only a third of the oxygen found at sea level. But on K2 in winter, the death zone is not a fixed line. It descends. The extreme cold and low pressure depress the atmosphere, pushing that lethal ceiling down to 6,000 or 7,000 meters. The moment Vitaliy stepped out of base camp, he was already walking into a biological trap. The enemy here wasn't a yeti or a curse. The enemy was physics. In February, on K2, the jet stream drops low, strafing the summit with winds that hit 100 miles per hour hurricane force. The temperature plummets to minus 50 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in seconds. But the cold does something even more insidious. It thickens the blood. Your heart, already screaming to pump oxygen that isn't there, has to push sludge through your veins. This is the environment Vitaliy Gorelik willingly entered. For weeks, the team fought the mountain. They were rotating men up and down, fixing ropes, establishing camps. It was brutal, manual labor. Imagine digging a trench in a frozen parking lot while breathing through a drinking straw, carrying a 60-pound pack, in a wind that wants to throw you off the face of the earth. Vitaliy was one of the strongest. He and his climbing partner Valery Topmianin were the spearhead. They were the ones pushing the route higher, fixing ropes up the Black Pyramid, a terrifying section of dark, unstable rock and ice that guards the upper slopes. It was here, in late January, that the summit fever, or perhaps more accurately for the Russians, the mission fever, began to obscure reality. They had reached 7,200 meters. They were so close to establishing Camp 4. The summit felt tangible. In the mind of an elite climber, suffering is just data. Cold fingers are data. A cough is data. You process it, you ignore it, and you keep moving. Vitaliy was a master at ignoring the data, but the body keeps the score. While working at 7,000 meters, hauling gear, and battling the wind, Vitaly's gloves were off for mere moments to manipulate carabinas, or perhaps the wind just cut through the insulation. It didn't matter how it happened. The frostbite set in. It started in his fingers, a numbness that didn't go away when he swung his arms. Then, the blackness. Frostbite is necrosis. It is the death of tissue while the host is still alive. Simultaneously, something worse was brewing in his chest. The dry, freezing air of K2 strips the lining of the lungs and throat. The kumbu cough is common, but for Vitaliy it was deepening. His lungs, fighting the altitude and the cold, were becoming inflamed. Pneumonia in the death zone is a death sentence because the only cure is thick, oxygen-rich air, and that was miles below him. Yet he didn't descend immediately. Why? This is the paradox of the elite. Vitaliy felt strong enough to continue working. He didn't want to let the team down. He didn't want to abandon the siege. The line between toughness and dying is invisible until you cross it. For days, he pushed his body past the red line, relying on a reserve of willpower that had never failed him before. He assumed he could finish his rotation, descend to base camp, warm up, and recover. He treated his body like a machine that just needed a quick repair. He didn't know that the machine was already broken beyond repair. By the time he and Topton decided to head down to base camp for rest on February 2nd, the trap had already snapped shut. The weather was turning. The barometer was dropping like a stone. K2 was inhaling, preparing to scream. Vitaliy Gorelik was descending, not toward safety, but into a race against a storm that would erase the exit. The death zone had marked him, and as he clipped into the ropes to rappel down, he was carrying the seeds of his own end inside his chest and on his blackened fingertips. The invisible enemy had already won. It was just waiting for him to realize it. The tragedy of the high mountains is often framed as a fall-off sudden, violent slip into the abyss. But for Vitaliy Gorelik, the turning point wasn't a fall. It was a slow, suffocating slide that began on February 2, 2012, at 7,200 meters. High on the Abruzzi spur, the timeline of survival began to warp. Vitaliy and his partners Valeri Topmanin and Nikolay Topmanin had successfully hauled gear up the Black Pyramid. They had done their job. They had fed the beast of the expedition. Now, they just had to get down. In any standard narrative, the descent is the resolution. But on K2 in winter, the descent is where the bill comes due. February 2nd, 8 o'clock hours, 7,200 meters. Vitaliy is preparing to rappel. This is the moment the turning point becomes physical. To rappel, you need dexterity. You need to manipulate the figure-8 device, handle the icy ropes, and clip carabiners. But Vitaliy's hands are no longer hands. They are wooden blocks. The frostbite has advanced rapidly, deeper than the skin, gnawing into the muscle. He doesn't complain. He doesn't scream. He simply fights the mechanics of his own equipment. Every transition at an anchor point takes 3 times as long as it should. The cold is not just outside. It is inside his gloves. February 2nd, 14 o'clock hours. The Black Pyramid. They are descending through the most technical section of the mountain. The Black Pyramid is a vertical maze of rock and black ice. Usually, climbers race down this to get to the thicker air of Camp 2, but Vitaliy is moving with the sluggishness of a man walking underwater. His breathing is ragged, too ragged. It's a wet, rattling sound that shouldn't exist at this altitude where the air is bone dry. The turning point here is subtle but devastating. Vitaliy is pushing through the pain barrier, assuming that descent equals recovery. It is the classic mountaineer's gamble. He believes that if he can just get to base camp, the oxygen richness of 5,000 meters will heal him. He is wrong. He is carrying the death zone down with him in his lungs. February 4th, base camp 5,000 meters. They arrive. The tents of the Russian team are typically a sanctuary warm, full of food, a place to laugh and recover. Vitaliy collapses into the mess tent. The expedition doctor, Sergei Bychkovsky, takes one look at Vitaliy and knows the siege is over for him. Vitaliy's hands are black, not the purple of bruising, but the deep necrotic charcoal of dead tissue. But the hands are the distraction. The real killer is the sound coming from his chest. It is pneumonia, aggravated by high-altitude exhaustion. His heart is beating wildly, trying to compensate for lungs that are filling with fluid. He is drowning on dry land. February 5th. The desperation of distance. This is the moment the trap snaps shut. The doctor makes the call. Vitaliy needs immediate evacuation. In the Himalayas, or the Alps, this is a phone call. In the Karakoram winter, it is a prayer. They radio for a helicopter. The Pakistani military pilots are brave, often flying machines into conditions that would ground commercial jets. But K2 has a defense mechanism. Look at the map in your mind. Base camp is at 5,000 meters. The nearest hospital is Skarju, a world away. Between them lies the Baltoro Glacier, 60 miles of jagged ice and rock. You cannot walk a man with pneumonia out of here. He would die in hours. The only way out is up via helicopter. The timeline of doom, February 5th to 6th, 10 a.m. The radio crackles. The helicopter is prepped in Skarju. Hope surges in the tent. Vitaliy is conscious, but weak. He is fighting for every breath, sitting upright to keep his lungs open. 12 p.m. The weather shifts. On K2, the weather doesn't change. It explodes. the barometric pressure drops. The wind begins to howl, not just at the summit, but down in the valley. The window for the helicopter, that tiny slice of clear air needed to navigate the treacherous valley walls, is closing. 2 p.m. The message comes through. The helicopter has launched. It is coming. The team prepares the landing pad on the glacier, marking the ice with dye, standing in the freezing wind, looking south. They listen for the thrum of rotors. 3:30 p.m. Silence. The wind is now tearing at the tents. The visibility drops to less than 50 meters. The radio sparks to life again. The pilot's voice is apologetic, but firm. Headwinds too strong. Visibility 0. Returning to base, the sound of the helicopter never came. Vitaliy is lying in his sleeping bag, hooked up to bottled oxygen. But the oxygen isn't helping because the interface's lungs is failing. The team surrounds him, helpless. These are men who can climb vertical ice walls, who can survive avalanches, who are the strongest humans on the planet. But they cannot stop a microbe. They cannot command the wind. The turning point has passed. They are no longer fighting for the summit. They are no longer fighting for the record. They are watching a friend fade away, trapped in a nylon tent while a hurricane rages outside, completely cut off from the rest of the world. The distance to Camp 4, usually the measure of danger, is irrelevant now. The distance to Skarju is the only metric that matters, and it might as well be the distance to the moon. The night of February 5th did not pass. It dragged itself across the Baltoro Glacier like a wounded animal. Inside the mess tent at base camp, the world had shrunk to a radius of 3 meters, the space occupied by a dying man and the silent, terrified brothers who watched him. We often romanticize the death of a mountaineer. We imagine it happening on a windswept ridge, looking out over the curvature of the earth, a moment of profound, frozen silence. But the reality of Vitaliy Gorelik's end was a claustrophobic horror. It was a medical emergency taking place in a nylon cage, battered by a storm that sounded like a freight train derailment that never ended. The illusion of heat. By the early hours of February 6th, Vitaliy was drifting in and out of consciousness. The pneumonia had filled his lungs with fluid, creating a terrifying paradox. He was a man capable of climbing the hardest ice in the world, yet he could not perform the simple act of inflating his own chest. His breath came in shallow, panicked rasps. The sound of wet, bubbling rattle filled the tent. It is a sound that no one forgets. It is the sound of the body drowning in its own fluids. Here lies the horror of the death zone physiology. Even at base camp, as his oxygen levels plummeted, his brain began to starve. In these final hours, the mind often breaks before the body. Hallucinations are common. We don't know exactly what Vitaliy saw, but we know what happens in the hypoxic brain. The tent walls dissolve. The howling wind transforms into voices, children calling, old friends laughing, the mundane sounds of a life left behind in Novasi. There is a phenomenon often seen in extreme hypothermia cases called paradoxical undressing, where the dying person, their nerves shattered by cold, suddenly feels an overwhelming burning heat. They tear off their clothes in a final delirious act of madness, before freezing. Vitaliy was likely spared the stripping, but the fever from pneumonia would have cooked him from the inside while the frostbite gnawed at his extremities. Imagine the torture of that duality. His hands were blocks of ice, dead and unfeeling, while his core burned with a fever that made him want to crawl out of his own skin. He was trapped between fire and ice. The impotence of the elite. The true moral dilemma of this night was a choice between saving him or the summit. That choice had already been made. The dilemma was the crushing realization of impotence. Sitting next to him were Nikolay Totmajanin and Valery Shbalo. These are men who solve problems with ice axes and ropes. They are men of action. If a crevasse opens, they build a bridge. If a wall is too steep, they fix a rope. But here, there was no wall to climb. There was no enemy to hit. There was only the biological failure of a friend. They had the best equipment money could buy. They had satellite phones. They had oxygen bottles. They had a direct line to the outside world. And yet, they were as helpless as cavemen. The storm outside had severed the link to the 21st century. The helicopter, the mechanical angel they had prayed for, was grounded in Skarju, its rotors tied down against the wind. The dilemma that knotted them in those dark hours was the question of responsibility. Did we push too hard? Did we ignore the signs on the Black Pyramid? When he said his hands were cold 3 days ago, why didn't we turn around then? In high-altitude mountaineering, there is a code. You are responsible for yourself. But that code breaks down when you are watching a teammate die inches away from you. The guilt is heavy, invisible, and suffocating. They administered CPR, they injected adrenaline, they tried to force oxygen into his system. But you cannot pump air into a sponge that is already full of water. The silence. At 11:30 a.m. on February 6th, the struggle ceased. The wet, rattling breathing stopped. The tent, which had been filled with the frantic energy of survival, suddenly felt vast and empty. Vitaliy Gorelik, the snow leopard, the man of iron, was gone. And then came the most haunting moment of all, the realization that life continues. The storm outside didn't stop. The wind didn't pause to mourn. The stove still hissed in the corner. The tea was still warm. The remaining climbers were left with a corpse in a sleeping bag and a silence that screamed louder than the blizzard. This is the grim reality of the death zone that documentaries rarely show. There is no too black. After the death, you are still there. You are still cold. You are still hungry. And now, you are sleeping next to the body of your friend. The psychological weight of that proximity is shattering. You look at his face now peaceful, the pain erased, and you see your own reflection. You see the possible future of every man who dares to step onto the savage mountain. The death of Vitaliy Gorelik forced the Russian team into the ultimate ethical corner. They were poised for the summit. They were arguably the strongest team ever assembled on K2 in winter. The summit was right there, a geometric obsession in the sky. To continue would be to honor his spirit, some might say. He would want us to finish. That is the lie climbers tell themselves to justify their addiction. But the Russians did something different. They looked at the body of their friend, and then they looked at the mountain. The spell was broken. The summit fever shattered instantly, replaced by a cold, hard grief. They realized that the mountain hadn't just defeated Vitaliy. It had sent a message to all of them. We are not welcome here. The dilemma was resolved not with a push for glory, but with a surrender to humanity. They decided, almost immediately, to cancel the expedition. It was a decision that cost them the history books, but saved their souls. They chose the memory of the dead over the glory of the living. But first, they had to deal with the physical reality of the aftermath. The body was still there. And on K2, the dead do not leave ice. The storm that killed Vitaliy Gorelik eventually broke. It is the cruelest trick K2 plays. After the violence, the sky turns a perfect, innocent blue. The helicopter that couldn't fly when he was breathing finally arrived when he was not. It didn't land to save a life, it landed to collect a casualty. The Russian team, usually a monolith of stoicism, was shattered. They didn't just lose a teammate, they lost the justification for their suffering. Expedition leader Viktor Kozlov didn't hesitate. There would be no pushing on in his honor. There would be no summit bid. The expedition was cancelled immediately. They packed their gear in silence, turning their backs on the mountain that had just claimed one of their strongest. It was a rare admission in the high-stakes world of alpinism, the mountain one. We are leaving. Vitaliy died at base camp, so his body was recovered, but his spirit joined a much darker fraternity. If you walk just a short distance from base camp, you will find the Gilkey Memorial. It is a cairn of stones, covered in tin plates and pot lids, each scratched with the name of a climber who never came home. This is the answer to the question that haunts every outsider. Why do they stay there? For those who die above 8,000 meters in, the true death zone recovery is impossible. To bring a body down from the Black Pyramid is to risk the lives of 4 living men. So, they stay. K2 is not just a mountain. It is a high-altitude cemetery. The bodies are preserved in the ice, dressed in bright neon gear, frozen in the exact moment of their desperate end. They become waypoints. Climbers step over them to reach the summit. Vitaliy's name is etched into the history of this savage place, not because he remains on the slopes, but because he represents the limit of human ambition. He was a snow leopard, a master of the cold, and yet, he was extinguished by a simple infection and a closed weather window. His death proved that on K2, skill is not enough. You need permission. It would take another 9 years until January 2021 for a team of Nepalese climbers to finally stand on the summit of K2 in winter. They achieved what Vitaliy died trying to do. But even that victory was soaked in blood. That same season, 5 other climbers died on the mountain. The legacy of Vitaliy Gorelik is a warning that is often ignored. We look at mountains as arenas for human triumph. We speak of conquering peaks, but K2 is not an arena. It is a geological indifference. It does not care if you are Russian, American, or Nepalese. It does not care if you have a family waiting in Novosibirsk. It demands a toll. In the end, the story of Vitaliy Gorelik isn't about the summit he missed. It's about the thin, fragile line between glory and the grave. It forces us to ask, what is the value of a view from the top, if the price is a frozen silence at the bottom? Vitaliy's team chose brotherhood over the summit. They turned around, but many others have stepped over the dying to reach the top, driven by a fever that overrides humanity. So, I turn the question to you. If you were 300 meters from the summit of K2, the dream of a lifetime, and you knew your partner was failing, would you turn back and lose it all? Or would you push for the top and hope they survive? Tell me your honest choice in the comments below. Most people lie and say they'd turn back, but at 8,000 meters, the truth is often much colder. I'm K2 Stories. Stay safe, and remember, the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory.